When a gang of reckless bikers storms into his small-town store, they think they've found an easy target. But they have no idea who they're messing with. Beneath his quiet demeanor lies a past forged in combat, one that's about to erupt with a vengeance. What happens when a man trained to save lives is pushed to the brink? Stay tuned, because this isn't just a fight, it's a reckoning. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The sun dipped low over the quiet town, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold. The streets, lined with modest homes and small businesses, seemed almost too peaceful, as if the world had momentarily forgotten them. At the heart of it all stood Jackson Miles's store, a humble, weather-worn building that radiated a certain warmth. Inside, the man himself moved with quiet precision, arranging cans on shelves and wiping down the counter. His hands, rough yet steady, spoke of years of labor, but his eyes hinted at something deeper, a history untold, a life once lived in chaos and fire. The bell above the door jingled, snapping Jackson out of his thoughts. A regular customer walked in, a young woman named Evelyn, her arms loaded with a basket of baked goods. She placed it on the counter with a smile that barely masked her concern. "Evening, Jackson. Thought you could use a little something sweet," she said, her voice light but probing. Jackson glanced at her offering, a loaf of bread, some pastries, wrapped neatly in paper. "Kind of you," he replied, his tone even. He nodded toward the shelves. "Everything all right at the bakery?" She hesitated, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah, it's just, I heard about what happened at the gas station." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Some bikers rolled through. Tore the place up pretty bad." Jackson's brow furrowed, but he didn't stop arranging the cans. "Trouble always has a way of finding its way here," he muttered. "They said they might come this way," Evelyn pressed. "You should be careful, Jackson. Folks rely on you, you know." He looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "I'll be fine, Evelyn. Thanks for the bread." She lingered for a moment, searching his face as if hoping to find a crack in his calm exterior. When she found none, she sighed and turned to leave. "Just watch your back," she said, before stepping out into the twilight. As the door shut behind her, Jackson stood motionless for a moment, his gaze fixed on the counter. Outside, the muffled sounds of the town drifted in, the hum of an engine, the laughter of children, the faint creak of a bicycle wheel. But beneath it all, there was a tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Jackson moved to lock the door, his hand lingering on the bolt. For a fleeting moment, he thought of another time, another door, a metal one, rattling under the weight of an explosion. His mind took him back to the desert, to a field hospital under siege, the cries of wounded soldiers echoing in his ears. He shook his head, dispelling the memory like a wisp of smoke, and turned off the lights. The town seemed quieter now as Jackson stepped outside to check on his property. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. He walked the perimeter of the store, his boots crunching against gravel. He spotted a broken fence post near the alley, likely from some kids fooling around. But something about it made him pause. He crouched to examine it, his trained eyes scanning the ground for anything out of place. A faint rumble in the distance pulled his attention. He straightened and peered down the road, his hand instinctively brushing against his belt. The sound grew louder, distinct now, the low, guttural growl of motorcycles. His jaw tightened as two headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the dusk like blades. The bikes slowed as they approached the store, their riders silhouetted against the fading light. Jackson stood his ground, his posture relaxed but his muscles coiled like a spring. The riders pulled to a stop a few yards away, their engines idling loudly. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard and a leather jacket adorned with patches, dismounted and sauntered toward Jackson with an air of arrogance. "Nice little place you got here," the man drawled, his voice rough and mocking. "Shame if something happened to it." Jackson didn't reply. His eyes met the biker's, cold and unwavering. The biker grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. Not much of a talker, huh? That's fine, we'll be back. You just make sure you're ready to play nice. He turned to his companion. Come on, let's not waste our time. They revved their engines and roared off into the night, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. Jackson watched them go, his face unreadable. When the sound of the bikes finally faded, he turned back to the store and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. For a long moment he stood in the dark, the weight of the past pressing down on him. His hand rested on the counter, his fingers brushing against a framed photograph. A younger Jackson in uniform, surrounded by his unit, their faces worn but proud. He picked up the frame, staring at it as if seeking guidance. Trouble always has a way of finding its way here, he murmured again, this time to himself. But this time his voice carried a steely resolve. He set the frame down, rolled up his sleeves, and began to prepare. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town, but the atmosphere felt heavy, like a storm brewing in plain sight. Jackson's store stood resolute, though the faint scent of exhaust and the scrape of motorcycle tires on gravel lingered from the previous night. Inside, Jackson worked with a quiet focus, reinforcing the hinges on the front door. His movements were deliberate, methodical, as if guided by instincts honed over years of training. A knock on the door interrupted his work. Jackson glanced up, his brow furrowing slightly. Outside, Evelyn stood holding a thermos and a basket. He opened the door but said nothing, letting her step inside. She placed the basket on the counter, her eyes scanning the room. "Figured you could use some coffee," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. She paused, noticing the hammer in his hand and the newly installed steel bar across the windows. "You expecting company?" Jackson set the hammer down, his expression unchanged. "Just being careful." Evelyn crossed her arms, her concern evident. "Jackson, I know you're not the kind to scare easy, but those bikers aren't just passing through. Word around town is they've been hitting places up and down the highway. They're trouble." "They've got a lot of bark," Jackson replied, his voice calm. "That doesn't mean they bite." Evelyn sighed, leaning against the counter. "They tore apart the gas station, ran old Carl out of his own place. You think they're just gonna leave you alone?" Jackson finally looked at her, his gaze steady. "They won't leave anyone alone. That's why I'm making sure I'm ready." Evelyn studied him, her frustration melting into something softer. Worry, maybe, or admiration. "You're not telling me everything, are you?" He didn't answer, instead turning back to his work. After a moment of silence, Evelyn placed a hand on his arm. "Whatever you're planning, just don't get yourself killed. This town needs you. We need you." Jackson gave her a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't worry about me, Evelyn. I've been through worse." She lingered for a moment longer before nodding and heading toward the door. As she left, the sound of children playing in the distance drifted through the open window, a bittersweet reminder of the peace that hung by a thread. By midday, the hum of activity returned to the town. Customers filtered in and out of the store, their conversations filled with nervous whispers about the bikers. Jackson overheard snippets as he worked, stories of vandalized businesses, stolen goods, and threats of violence. The unease spread like wildfire, but Jackson's calm presence seemed to steady the nerves of those who crossed his threshold. A wiry teenager named Toby, who often ran errands for Jackson, arrived with a bundle of supplies. His eyes were wide with excitement as he set the boxes on the counter. "Mr. Miles, did you hear?" Toby asked breathlessly. "Those bikers are staying out near the old mill. Carl said there's at least 10 of them, maybe more." Jackson raised an eyebrow, his hands never stopping as he unpacked the box. "You been spying on them, Toby?" The boy flushed but grinned sheepishly. "Not spying, just looking around. They've got all these bikes lined up and a big old bonfire going. It's like something out of a movie." Jackson glanced at him, his tone firm but not unkind. "You stay away from them. They're not the kind of people you mess with." Toby shrugged but nodded. "You think they'll come back here?" Jackson didn't answer immediately, his mind turning over the information. "If they do, We'll handle it." The boy looked at him with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "You're not scared of them, are you?" Jackson met Toby's gaze, his voice steady. "Fear doesn't solve problems, Toby. Preparation does." As night fell, the town seemed to hold its breath. Lights flickered on in homes and doors were bolted shut. In the distance, the faint roar of motorcycles echoed like a warning. Jackson stood by the front window of his store. The street outside bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. He watched and waited, his instincts sharp, his mind clear. A sound broke the silence, a faint rustling from the alley beside the store. Jackson moved quietly, his steps soundless as he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the back door. He opened it slowly, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. There, crouched near the trash bins, was a young man, scruffy, nervous, and barely out of his teens. He froze when the light hit him, his hands raised defensively. "Don't shoot. I'm not here to steal anything," the boy stammered. Jackson lowered the flashlight slightly but kept his guard up. "Then what are you doing here?" The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. I need your help. They're gonna kill me." Jackson's expression hardened. "Who's gonna kill you?" The boy swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "The bikers. I tried to leave and Rex doesn't let anyone leave." Jackson's grip on the flashlight tightened. His voice dropped to a low, measured tone. "You better come inside." Jackson closed the door behind them, locking it with a deliberate twist of his wrist. The young man, jittery and breathing hard, stood awkwardly near the counter. His eyes darted around the store as though he expected the bikers to burst in at any moment. Jackson set the flashlight on the counter and crossed his arms, studying the boy in silence. "What's your name?" Jackson asked, his voice calm but commanding. Luke," the boy stammered. He wiped his hands on his jeans, his palms slick with sweat. "I didn't know where else to go. I swear I'm not lying." Jackson nodded once, pulling out a stool and motioning for Luke to sit. "Start from the beginning," he said, his tone leaving no room for half-truths. "And don't leave anything out." Luke hesitated, glancing toward the windows. The faint hum of distant engines sent a shiver down his spine. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I joined up with them a few months ago. At first, it was just about the freedom, you know. Riding, partying, no rules. But Rex, he's not like the rest of us. He's ruthless. If you cross him, he makes sure everyone knows what happens to traitors." Jackson leaned against the counter, his face impassive but his eyes sharp. "What made you want to leave?" Luke's shoulders slumped, the weight of his fear pressing down on him. "The gas station. I didn't sign up for that kind of thing. Rex made me hold the guy down while he smashed up the place. I couldn't do it anymore. I told him I was out, and now he's hunting me." Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "Why come here?" Luke looked up, desperation in his eyes. "Everyone knows you don't scare easy. People say you were some kind of soldier. I figured if anyone could stand up to Rex, it's you." For a moment, Jackson didn't respond. He regarded Luke with a measured calm, as if weighing his words against something unseen. Then he turned, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a first aid kit. He set it on the counter and motioned for Luke to hold out his hands. Luke blinked, confused. "What are you?" "Your knuckles are split," Jackson said simply. "Probably from hitting something. Or someone." Luke hesitated, but extended his hands. Jackson cleaned and wrapped them with practiced efficiency, his movements steady and precise. "If you're going to stick around, you're going to need more than a sob story," Jackson said as he worked. "Rex isn't going to stop just because you're scared." "I know," Luke muttered, wincing as the antiseptic stung. I don't know what to do." Jackson finished wrapping the bandages and set the kit aside. He leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "You do what needs to be done. That's the only way you survive." Luke looked at him, his fear momentarily eclipsed by awe. "You really were a soldier, weren't you?" Jackson didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the window and peered out into the darkness. The hum of engines had faded, but the unease remained, settling over the store like a shadow. He turned back to Luke, his expression unreadable. "You're staying here tonight," Jackson said. "Upstairs out of sight. In the morning we'll figure out what to do next." Luke nodded, relief flooding his features. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Jackson replied. "This isn't over." The hours stretched on, the store enveloped in an uneasy silence. Jackson sat at the kitchen table upstairs, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the room. Luke was sprawled on the couch, his breathing steady but shallow, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. Jackson reached for the framed photograph he'd brought upstairs earlier. His fingers traced the edges, his mind drifting back to another life. The faces in the photo stared back at him, men and women he'd served with, bonded by blood and fire. He thought of the promises they'd made to each other, promises that were often broken by the realities of war. A soft knock broke through his reverie. Jackson's head snapped up, his body tensing. He rose silently, his movements fluid, and approached the door. With a glance at Luke to ensure the boy was still asleep, Jackson opened the door a crack. Evelyn stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with worry. "Evelyn," Jackson said, his voice low. "It's late, what's wrong?" She stepped inside quickly, glancing toward the couch where Luke stirred but didn't wake. "I didn't want to say anything earlier, but I saw them," she whispered. "The bikers. They're circling the town. It's like they're waiting for something." Jackson closed the door behind her, his jaw tightening. "How many?" "At least 10, maybe more," she said, her voice trembling. "Jackson, this isn't just about your store anymore. They're scaring everyone." Jackson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying. "Go home, Evelyn. Lock your doors and keep your lights off. I'll take care of this." Her eyes searched his, filled with doubt and hope. "Just don't do anything reckless." Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Reckless isn't my style." As Evelyn slipped back into the night, Jackson turned toward the sleeping boy and then back to the window. The weight of the night pressed heavier on his shoulders, but his resolve hardened. The storm was coming, and Jackson Miles was ready. The night deepened, and the weight of impending danger hung heavy in the air. Jackson sat at the kitchen table, his back straight, his hands resting on the worn wooden surface. The light above cast shadows across his face, emphasizing the lines etched by years of experience and loss. On the couch, Luke stirred fitfully, murmuring in his sleep. Jackson glanced at him briefly, his mind already working through scenarios, plans, contingencies. The quiet was broken by a faint sound, a soft rumble, distant but unmistakable. Jackson froze, his senses sharpening. The sound grew louder, the growl of engines rolling through the town like a slow-moving thundercloud. He stood, moving to the window with practiced silence, and peered out through the curtains. Headlights pierced the darkness, cutting across the main road in slow, deliberate arcs. The bikers were moving. Jackson turned back toward the couch, his voice low but firm. "Luke, wake up." Luke groaned, blinking blearily as he sat up. What's going on?" "They're here," Jackson said, already moving to the corner where a small duffel bag sat. He unzipped it with a swift, purposeful motion, revealing an assortment of supplies: zip ties, duct tape, a utility knife, and a flashlight. His hand hovered over the bag for a moment before pulling out a compact first aid kit, which he slipped into his pocket. Luke's eyes widened as he stumbled to his feet. "What do you mean they're here? You think they know I'm here?" "I don't think," Jackson replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I know." The boy paled, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What are we going to do?" Jackson turned to him, his expression steady, his voice calm. "We're going to stay quiet and stay out of sight. Upstairs is the safest place for now. They won't risk coming in without knowing what's waiting for them." "But what if they—" "They won't," Jackson interrupted, his voice cutting through Luke's panic. "Not yet. They're testing the waters, looking to see if anyone's going to make it easy for them. We don't give them that." Luke nodded, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. Okay, I'll stay up here. Just don't leave me, all right?" Jackson gave him a brief, reassuring look. I won't. He moved to the window again, his sharp eyes scanning the street below. The bikers had spread out, their figures dimly illuminated by the glow of their headlights. Some dismounted, their silhouettes moving toward the edges of the buildings, checking doors, rattling locks. Their movements were calculated, probing, like wolves testing the strength of a fence. From the alley came a loud crash, a trash can knocked over, the sound sharp in the stillness. Jackson's jaw tightened as he watched two figures approach the back of the store, their movements stealthy but unmistakable. He slipped away from the window, his steps silent, and motioned for Luke to follow him toward the hallway. "Stay in the corner," Jackson whispered, pointing to a shadowed spot near the stairs. "Don't move unless I say." Luke crouched down, his face pale and his breathing shaky. Jackson moved back toward the stairs, his body low and his steps measured. He reached the top of the stairwell and crouched, his ears straining for any sound over the hum of the engines outside. Then it came, a faint scratching at the back door. Jackson's hand moved instinctively to his belt, where he'd tucked a heavy flashlight. His mind raced, calculating distances, angles, timing. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, followed by the faint creak of the handle turning. Jackson's grip tightened, his muscles coiled like a spring. The door didn't give. Reinforced earlier that day, it held firm against the intruder's probing. There was a low grunt of frustration, then a voice, deep and gravelly, dripping with menace. "Locked up tight," the voice muttered. "Figures. Guy's not stupid." "Should we bust it down?" another voice asked, younger, cocky. "No," the first voice growled. "We wait. Rex'll want to handle this himself." Jackson's mind locked onto the name like a predator catching a scent. Rex. The leader, the one who orchestrated the chaos, the one Luke had fled from. If Rex was here, it meant the situation was more dangerous than Jackson had anticipated. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a siege. The voices outside faded, their owners retreating to regroup. Jackson exhaled quietly, his tension easing only slightly. He returned to Luke, who was still crouched in the shadows, his eyes wide with fear. "They're not coming in yet," Jackson said softly, "but they will. And when they do, we're going to be ready." Luke swallowed hard, nodding. "What's the plan?" Jackson stood, his expression grim but resolute. "We make them regret coming here." The faint rumble of motorcycles echoed through the night, retreating for now but leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to suffocate the small town. Jackson moved with quiet purpose, his steps deliberate as he descended the stairs to the store below. The air felt colder, thicker, as if the walls themselves could sense the weight of what was coming. Luke followed cautiously, his steps hesitant, his nerves raw. Jackson walked to the counter, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved an old, well-worn notebook. Its cover was faded, the corners frayed, but it was neatly organized inside, filled with diagrams, notes, and hastily drawn sketches. Luke stood awkwardly nearby, his eyes darting between the notebook and the reinforced windows. "What's that?" Luke asked, his voice trembling slightly. Jackson didn't look up. "Plans." "For what?" Luke pressed, his curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. Jackson turned a page, revealing a detailed layout of the store. Each room, each window, each exit was marked with annotations written in sharp, precise handwriting. "For situations like this." Luke's brow furrowed. "You've done this before?" Jackson's eyes flicked to him, sharp and assessing. "Enough to know how to be ready." Before Luke could ask more, Jackson closed the notebook and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He moved to a cabinet in the corner, unlocking it with a key he kept on a chain around his neck. Inside were neatly organized tools, a crowbar, rolls of wire, duct tape, and a few items Luke couldn't immediately identify. Jackson grabbed a coil of wire and a set of nails, placing them on the counter. "What are you going to do?" Luke asked, a hint of awe creeping into his voice. Jackson began unspooling the wire with practiced ease. "I'm going to make sure that if they come in here, it'll be the last mistake they make." Luke swallowed hard, watching as Jackson worked. "You're not just some store owner, are you?" Jackson paused, his hand steady as he fastened the wire around a sturdy nail. He glanced at Luke, his expression unreadable. Not always. The boy shifted uncomfortably, sensing there was more to Jackson's story than he was willing to share. Why'd you leave it? The other life, I mean. Jackson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the front door, carefully examining the frame and the reinforced locks. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. Because war takes more than it gives, and when it's over, you spend the rest of your life trying to remember who you were before it started. Luke didn't know how to respond, so he stayed silent, watching as Jackson's focus returned to the task at hand. The hours crept by, the store falling into an uneasy stillness. Jackson worked methodically, securing the entrances and creating makeshift traps using his supplies. A board studded with nails was placed just inside the back door, hidden beneath an old rug. Wire was strung low across the hallway, taut enough to trip anyone who wasn't paying attention. Each step of his preparation was calculated, precise, and undeniably effective. Luke tried to help where he could, holding tools or handing Jackson supplies. But his hands trembled, and his thoughts raced. "Do you think they'll really come back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jackson glanced at him as he secured a window. "Not think." "No, but why? What do they want so bad?" Jackson tightened the final screw and turned to face Luke, his expression hard. "Control. Fear. It's not about what they want. It's about what they can take. And if you give them an inch, they'll take everything." Luke nodded, though his unease remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jackson was preparing for something much worse than he let on. The quiet was shattered by a loud, echoing sound, a single engine revving, breaking the stillness of the night. Jackson froze, his head tilting slightly as he listened. The sound was joined by another, then another, until the roar of motorcycles filled the air like the growl of an approaching storm. Luke's eyes widened, and he backed toward the counter. "They're back," he whispered. Jackson's movements were swift but calm. He turned off the lights, plunging the store into darkness, then motioned for Luke to follow him toward the stairs. "Upstairs, now!" They moved quickly but silently, ascending the stairs as the sound of engines grew louder. Jackson stopped at the top, crouching low near the window. He parted the curtains just enough to see the street below. The bikers were gathering, their motorcycles forming a rough semicircle in front of the store. Rex, the leader, stood in the center, his imposing figure lit by the glow of a nearby street lamp. He removed his helmet, revealing a face weathered by time and violence, his eyes cold and calculating. "Jackson Miles," Rex's voice boomed, cutting through the night. "Come on out, friend. We just want to have a little talk." Jackson didn't move, his gaze fixed on the scene below. He watched as Rex paced back and forth, his posture casual but radiating menace. "We know you've got our boy in there," Rex called, his tone sharp. "You think you can just take what's mine and get away with it? That's not how this works." Luke crouched beside Jackson, his face pale. "What do we do?" Jackson's voice was steady, almost a whisper. "We wait. Let them make the first move." Rex stopped pacing and looked directly at the store, his eyes narrowing. "You've got one chance to come out and hand him over, or we'll come in and take him. Your choice." The bikers roared in approval, their engines revving in unison. Jackson remained still, his mind racing, calculating his next move. Luke's breathing quickened, and Jackson placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "They're not getting in," Jackson said softly. "Not tonight." The roar of the motorcycles outside ebbed into a steady rumble, a predatory growl as the gang waited for Jackson to respond. From his vantage point upstairs, Jackson kept his focus on the leader, Rex, whose commanding presence anchored the mob. The man was playing a game of intimidation, and Jackson wasn't about to flinch. Rex turned to his crew, raising a hand to silence them. The engines quieted, leaving an eerie stillness that made Luke's shallow breathing sound thunderous in comparison. Jackson didn't move, his mind working through the layers of strategy. He knew Rex wasn't the type to bluff. This was a test, a probe to see if Jackson would crack under pressure. "Tick-tock, Miles," Rex called out, his voice laced with mockery. "I'm losing my patience and you really don't want that." Luke shifted uneasily beside Jackson, his voice barely audible. "What happens if they come in?" "They won't," Jackson replied, his tone firm. "Not yet, they're trying to rattle us. But the second they cross that door, they'll regret it." Luke swallowed hard, his gaze darting between Jackson and the window. What if Rex isn't bluffing? What if he's ready to? A sudden crash from the back of the store cut him off. The noise was sharp and deliberate, like something heavy being thrown against the door. Jackson's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing. "They're testing the back entrance," Jackson said, his voice low. "Stay here." "What? No!" Luke started, but Jackson silenced him with a sharp look. "Stay quiet," Jackson ordered, his voice like steel. "And stay out of sight." Luke nodded reluctantly, retreating into the shadows. Jackson moved with the silence of a predator, descending the stairs and slipping into the store's darkened interior. He crouched near the back door, listening intently as muffled voices drifted through the heavy wood. "Locked up tight," one voice muttered. "Figures. Guy's smarter than he looks." "What do we do?" another asked, younger and impatient. "We wait for Rex's signal," the first replied. "No one moves until he says so." Jackson's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, his fingers brushing against the handle of the crowbar he'd stashed near the doorway earlier. His instincts screamed for action, but he forced himself to hold back. Timing was everything. If he acted too soon, he'd lose the element of surprise. He moved to the front of the store, staying low and out of sight. Through the window, he saw Rex pacing again, his posture more aggressive now. The man's patience was running thin, and Jackson could see the signs: a clenched jaw, quickened movements, a growing tension in his shoulders. Rex stopped abruptly and turned toward the store. "All right, Miles," he shouted, his voice echoing through the street. "You made your choice, we're coming in." The bikers roared their approval, their engines revving like a war cry. Jackson's pulse quickened, but his mind remained calm. He positioned himself near the front door, gripping the crowbar tightly. He'd fortified the entrances well, but he knew the first wave would test his defenses and his resolve. The sound of footsteps approached the door, heavy boots crunching against the gravel outside. Jackson braced himself, his body coiled and ready. The doorknob rattled, followed by a loud bang as someone kicked the door, testing its strength. "You better hope this place holds up, old man," a voice jeered from outside, "'cause we're coming through." Jackson allowed himself a small, grim smile. They were playing right into his hands. The next kick triggered the trap. A hidden mechanism above the door released, sending a cascade of heavy metal pipes crashing down onto the biker below. The man let out a startled yell, followed by a loud thud as he hit the ground. His companions cursed and stumbled back, momentarily thrown off balance. Inside, Jackson moved quickly, using the distraction to reposition himself near the back of the store. He checked the hallway trap, a taut wire stretched across the floor, and made a minor adjustment to ensure it was perfectly set. The bikers regrouped outside, their frustration palpable. "Get the damn door open!" someone shouted. Jackson glanced toward the stairs where Luke was peeking down cautiously. Their eyes met, and Jackson gave him a brief nod, signaling that everything was under control. Luke nodded back, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of hope. The sound of another crash came from the back door, louder and more forceful this time. Jackson moved swiftly, positioning himself near the rear entrance. He crouched low, the crowbar held firmly in his grip, and waited. The door shuddered under another blow, the wood creaking ominously. Jackson's breathing slowed, his focus narrowing. The bikers were about to discover that they'd underestimated the wrong man. The back door buckled under another heavy blow, the frame groaning as if protesting against the violence. Jackson crouched in the shadows, his crowbar steady in his hand. His eyes flicked to the rug he'd carefully laid earlier, concealing the nail-studded board underneath. The trap was simple but effective, perfect for uninvited guests. A loud crack split the air as the door splintered, the lock finally giving way. The first biker hesitated, peering into the dimly lit interior. He muttered something to the man behind him, his tone wary. "Looks quiet," the first man said, stepping cautiously into the hallway. His boots clicked against the wooden floor, the sound amplified by the stillness of the night. His eyes scanned the shadows, his grip tightening on the crowbar in his hand. Jackson held his breath, watching as the man moved forward. The biker's foot caught on the wire strung across the hallway, jerking him off balance. He stumbled, cursing loudly, and stepped directly onto the hidden board. The sharp crack of nails piercing through his boot was followed by a blood-curdling scream. The second man rushed in, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "What happened? You good?" he called, his voice tense. "No, I'm not good, you idiot," the first man bellowed, clutching his injured foot. "It's a trap. The whole place is rigged." The second man turned, his flashlight sweeping over the room. The beam landed on Jackson, who stood just a few feet away, his crowbar gleaming faintly in the dim light. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Jackson's face was a mask of calm determination. Before the man could react, Jackson moved. He swung the crowbar with precision, striking the flashlight and sending it clattering to the floor. The biker lunged forward, but Jackson sidestepped smoothly, bringing the crowbar down on the man's wrist. The thug yelped, dropping his weapon, and Jackson shoved him backward, sending him crashing into the injured man. The two bikers collapsed in a heap, groaning and cursing. Jackson stepped back, his movements fluid and controlled. He knew better than to linger. His traps had done their job, but the noise would draw more of the gang to the back entrance. He retreated quickly, moving toward the stairs. As he ascended, he heard the unmistakable roar of motorcycles approaching again, the gang regrouping outside. Jackson reached the second floor and found Luke crouched near the window, peering through a small crack in the curtains. "They're all over the place," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "There's more of them now." Jackson joined him, his sharp eyes scanning the scene below. More bikes had pulled up, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Rex stood at the center, his stance tense but confident. He barked orders at his crew, his voice carrying easily over the noise. "Take the back, take the sides," Rex commanded, his tone clipped and efficient. "He's not getting out of this." Jackson's jaw tightened as he watched the bikers fan out, their movements coordinated and purposeful. These weren't amateurs. Rex had trained them well, and their growing numbers meant the odds were shifting against him. Luke's voice broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Jackson turned to him, his expression grim but resolute. "We adapt." He moved to the center of the room, pulling open a small chest that sat against the wall. Inside were more supplies, tools, ropes, and a few items Luke couldn't immediately identify. Jackson pulled out a small compact device and held it up for a moment before attaching it to the windowsill. "What's that?" Luke asked, his curiosity tinged with panic. "An alarm," Jackson replied. "If they try to climb in, we'll know." Luke nodded, though his fear was still evident. "What about the rest of them?" "There's too many." Jackson glanced at him, his voice steady. "Numbers don't matter if you control the terrain. This is my ground and they don't know what they're walking into." Luke swallowed hard, the weight of Jackson's words sinking in. "You really think we can hold them off?" Jackson's gaze hardened. "We don't have a choice." The sounds of the bikers outside grew louder, their boots crunching against gravel as they approached the building. Jackson moved swiftly, checking the traps he'd set earlier and reinforcing weak points. Every step was calculated, every movement purposeful. As the first loud bang echoed through the store, likely a makeshift battering ram against the front door, Jackson paused, his eyes narrowing. He turned to Luke, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Stay low, stay quiet, and follow my lead," Jackson said. "This isn't over." Luke nodded, his fear giving way to a flicker of determination. He moved to the corner, clutching a heavy wrench Jackson had handed him earlier. The bikers outside roared again, their shouts filling the night with violence and fury. Jackson positioned himself near the top of the stairs, his crowbar at the ready. The storm was about to break, and he would meet it head-on. The store shuddered as another loud crash echoed through the front door. Jackson crouched at the top of the stairs, his body still but his mind racing. The battering ram they were using was crude but effective, and it wouldn't be long before they broke through. The bikers were loud, taunting, their voices carrying into the night. "Come on, Miles," one shouted, his voice laced with mockery. "You hiding up there like a coward?" Another joined in, his tone sharper. "Let's see how tough you are when we're face to face." Jackson remained motionless, his grip firm on the crowbar. His eyes flicked toward Luke, who was tucked in the shadows of the upstairs hallway. The boy clutched his wrench tightly, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. Jackson gave him a quick nod, signaling for him to stay put. The door downstairs groaned under another impact, then finally gave way with a loud crack. The bikers cheered, their boots thudding heavily against the floor as they poured into the store. Jackson's traps went to work immediately. The first man to step through triggered a hidden wire that snapped a row of heavy cans from the shelves, crashing down on him in a cascade of metal and glass. He went down with a shout, clutching his head. Another biker slipped on the debris and fell hard, his curses ringing out as he scrambled to his feet. "Careful, you idiots," someone barked. "It's booby-trapped." The group hesitated, their bravado faltering as they realized the danger they were walking into. Jackson's calm voice rang out from the top of the stairs, cutting through the chaos below. "You're in over your heads," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. "Turn around and no one else gets hurt." The bikers froze, their eyes snapping upward. Rex, who had just stepped through the shattered doorway, let out a sharp laugh. His presence seemed to reinvigorate the group, their hesitation melting away under his commanding gaze. "You've got guts, Miles. I'll give you that," Rex called, his voice dripping with amusement. "But you're outnumbered, and your little traps won't save you." Jackson didn't respond. He stepped back into the shadows, his figure disappearing from view. Rex's smirk faded slightly, his confidence tempered by the unknown. "Spread out," Rex ordered, his tone sharp. "Find him, and someone check the upstairs." The bikers moved cautiously now, their earlier bravado replaced by a wary tension. Two of them approached the staircase, their weapons drawn, while the others fanned out to search the rest of the store. The floorboards creaked under their weight, every sound amplified in the stillness. Jackson waited, his breathing steady, his muscles coiled. The first biker ascended the stairs slowly, his eyes darting around nervously. He held a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other, his grip tight. The second man followed close behind, muttering under his breath. "This place gives me the creeps," the second man said. "Feels like he's watching us." "He is," Jackson's voice came from the darkness, low and menacing. The biker with the flashlight froze, his breath hitching. Before he could react, Jackson struck. He swung the crowbar with precision, knocking the flashlight from the man's hand and plunging the hallway into darkness. A second blow caught the biker in the stomach, doubling him over with a pained grunt. The second man lunged forward, swinging his bat wildly. Jackson sidestepped easily, his movements fluid and controlled. He used the momentum of his dodge to shove the man into the wall, disorienting him. Before the biker could recover, Jackson delivered a swift, calculated blow to his leg, sending him crashing to the ground. Both men were down, groaning and cursing in the dim light. Jackson stepped over them, his focus already shifting back to the sounds below. He knew the others would be closing in soon, and the traps would only hold them off for so long. He moved back toward Luke, who was still crouched in the shadows, his eyes wide with fear and awe. "They'll come up in force next," Jackson said, his voice calm but urgent. "We're going to make sure they regret it." Luke nodded, his grip tightening on the wrench. "What do you need me to do?" Jackson handed him a small flashlight and pointed toward the corner of the hallway. "Shine this down the stairs when I say, blind them, then get back behind cover." Luke swallowed hard but nodded again, his determination outweighing his fear. He moved into position, his body trembling but his resolve steady. Downstairs, Rex's voice rang out, sharp and angry. "What's the holdup? Get up there and finish this." Jackson stepped into the center of the hallway, his silhouette barely visible against the dim light. He tightened his grip on the crowbar and waited, his heart steady, his mind clear. The next wave was coming, and Jackson Miles was ready. The clatter of boots on the wooden floor below echoed like thunder, followed by shouted orders and curses. Jackson's calm exterior masked the storm of calculations running through his mind. The next wave of bikers would be more coordinated, more aggressive, and he needed every advantage he could leverage. Luke crouched at the end of the hallway, tightened his grip on the flashlight. His fingers trembled, but his jaw was set with determination. Jackson glanced at him briefly, his eyes sharp and steady, giving the boy a sense of borrowed strength. From the stairs came the sound of multiple men advancing, their steps heavy but deliberate. The lead biker held a machete, its blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. He moved cautiously, scanning the shadows for movement while two others followed close behind, their weapons ready. Jackson raised a hand, signaling Luke to prepare. The boy nodded, his breathing shallow but controlled. They waited in tense silence as the bikers climbed higher, the air between them charged with impending violence. The leader reached the top of the stairs, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Jackson standing in the center of the hallway. Jackson's silhouette was imposing, his stance unyielding, his crowbar resting against his shoulder like an extension of himself. "You think you're tough, old man?" the biker sneered, his machete raised. "Let's see how tough you are when—" "Now," Jackson barked, cutting him off. Luke flicked on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness and directly into the eyes of the advancing bikers. The sudden brightness disoriented them, eliciting curses and shouts of frustration. Jackson moved instantly, his crowbar a blur as he struck the leader's weapon hand with a forceful swing. The machete clattered to the ground, and the man stumbled back, clutching his wrist. The second biker lunged blindly, swinging a bat in Jackson's direction. Jackson ducked low, driving the end of the crowbar into the man's stomach with a precise jab. The biker doubled over, gasping for air, and Jackson followed up with a sharp blow to the side of his head, sending him sprawling to the floor. The third man hesitated, his confidence shaken as he shielded his eyes from the light. Jackson stepped forward, his movements swift and relentless. He swept the man's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Before the biker could recover, Jackson pressed the crowbar against his chest, pinning him in place. "Call them off," Jackson growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Or you'll be next." The biker stared up at him, fear flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but a sharp whistle from downstairs interrupted. The sound was piercing, commanding, and unmistakably Rex's. "Fall back!" Rex's voice boomed. "Everyone fall back!" The bikers on the stairs froze, then scrambled to obey. The leader, still clutching his injured wrist, glared at Jackson before retreating down the steps. Jackson let the pinned man go, watching as he stumbled to his feet and followed the others. The sound of boots retreating filled the store, and then there was silence. Jackson stepped back into the shadows, his chest rising and falling steadily. Luke lowered the flashlight, his face pale but his eyes wide with awe. You stopped them," Luke stammered. "I thought they'd—" "This isn't over," Jackson interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. "They're regrouping. Rex doesn't back off unless he's got a plan." Luke swallowed hard, nodding. "What do we do now?" Jackson moved to the window, peering through the curtains. Below, the bikers were gathering near their motorcycles, their voices a mix of anger and frustration. Rex stood at the center, his stance rigid, his face twisted with a cold fury. "We finish this," Jackson said quietly, more to himself than to Luke. "Before they do." Downstairs, the air was thick with tension as Rex barked orders at his crew, his voice carried into the night, sharp and unyielding. "He's not just some storekeeper," Rex growled, pacing back and forth. "He's military. Has to be. The way he's handling this, the traps, the tactics, it all fits." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "What do we do? He's got the high ground and we've already lost 3 guys. Rex stopped, his gaze hard and calculating. "We flush him out. Smoke him out if we have to." The scarred man hesitated. "You sure?" "We'll burn the whole place down." Rex's eyes narrowed. "If that's what it takes." Upstairs, Jackson turned from the window, his expression grim. "They're getting desperate. Rex isn't walking away from this without making a statement." Luke's eyes widened. "You think they'll try to burn us out?" Jackson finished. "Yeah." He moved quickly, checking the hallway and windows for weaknesses. "We need to be ready. If they make their move, we hit them hard and fast." Luke nodded, his fear tempered by a growing determination. "I'll do whatever you need." Jackson gave him a brief nod of approval. "Stay close. Watch my back. We've got one chance to end this." As the two prepared for the final confrontation, the sound of engines revving below sent a chill through the air. The storm was reaching its peak, and Jackson knew the next few moments would decide everything. The engines below roared to life, the bikers' taunts and shouts blending into a chaotic symphony of menace. Jackson stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the dim light outside. His sharp eyes tracked the movements of the gang as they spread out, positioning themselves strategically around the store. Rex was at the center of it all, his commanding presence driving the bikers like pawns on a chessboard. Jackson turned away from the window and faced Luke, who stood clutching the wrench like a lifeline. "It's about to get worse," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "If they try to burn us out, we'll need to move fast. Stay low, stay quiet, and do exactly what I say." Luke nodded, his fear still evident but tempered by a flicker of resolve. "I'm ready," he said, though his voice betrayed a tremor. Jackson crouched by the corner of the hallway, pulling out a small device from his jacket. It was a compact extinguisher, the kind meant for close-quarters emergencies. He placed it on the floor beside Luke. "If they throw anything that burns, aim for the base of the fire. Keep it contained." "What about you?" Luke asked, his voice tight. Jackson checked his crowbar, then glanced toward the stairs. "I'll deal with them." Outside, Rex's patience had worn thin. He motioned for one of his men who carried a crude Molotov cocktail in hand. "Light it," Rex ordered, his voice cold. "Let's see if he still wants to play hero when the whole place is up in flames." The biker hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the store. "What if the fire spreads? It could take out the whole block." Rex's glare was icy, his tone brooking no argument. "That's not my problem. Light it." The man obeyed, igniting the rag stuffed into the bottle's neck. The flame danced, casting flickering shadows across his face. With a grunt, he hurled the Molotov toward the store, the glass bottle arcing through the air and shattering against the front wall. Flames licked up the wood, the fire spreading quickly. The bikers cheered, their shouts of triumph cutting through the night inside. Jackson heard the crash and saw the orange glow reflected in the windows. He moved instantly, his motions swift and purposeful. Grabbing the extinguisher, he raced down the stairs, his boots hitting the floor with a muted thud. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air as the flames began to take hold. Jackson aimed the extinguisher at the base of the fire and squeezed the trigger. A jet of foam smothered the flames, the hiss of chemical suppression overpowering the crackle of burning wood. Within moments, the fire was extinguished, leaving behind scorched wood and a cloud of smoke. He turned back to the stairs, his voice sharp. "Luke, upstairs now." Luke scrambled down, his footsteps frantic as he joined Jackson. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice panicked. Jackson motioned for him to stay low. "They'll try again. I'll draw them in. When they come, you hit the lights." Luke nodded, retreating to the corner with trembling hands. Jackson moved to the door, crouching by the wall. He could hear the bikers outside, their voices growing louder as they rallied for another push. "Didn't think you'd put it out so quick," Rex called, his tone mocking. "You're full of surprises, Miles. Let's see how long you can keep it up." Jackson didn't respond. He waited, his breathing steady, his body coiled like a spring. He knew Rex was playing for time, trying to push him into making a mistake, but Jackson wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Another Molotov flew through the shattered front window, landing on the floor with a dull thud. Jackson was ready. He grabbed the extinguisher and doused the flames before they could spread, his movements efficient and practiced. The bikers outside cursed, their frustration mounting. Rex's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Enough games, get in there and take him out." The sound of boots approached the front entrance, heavier and more determined this time. Jackson positioned himself near the door, gripping the crowbar tightly. The first man stepped through, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the dimly lit store. Jackson struck without hesitation. The crowbar connected with the man's shoulder, sending him crashing into the wall. Another biker rushed in, swinging wildly. But Jackson sidestepped, his counterstrike swift and decisive. The man went down hard, groaning as he hit the floor. From the corner, Luke flicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness and blinding the next wave of intruders. Jackson moved like a shadow, his strikes precise and relentless. The bikers' confidence faltered as they stumbled over the wreckage of their comrades. The fight raged on, the store becoming a battleground. Jackson's traps continued to do their work, tripping and disorienting the attackers. But the bikers kept coming, their numbers overwhelming despite their losses. Above the chaos, Rex's voice rang out again, sharp and commanding. "Pull back! Regroup!" The remaining bikers retreated, dragging their injured companions with them. Jackson stood in the center of the room, his chest rising and falling with exertion, his grip on the crowbar steady. Smoke hung in the air, mingling with the tension that crackled like electricity. Luke emerged from his corner, his face pale but determined. "Did we win?" Jackson's expression was grim. "Not yet. Rex isn't done, and neither are we." Outside, the bikers gathered, their faces etched with anger and fear. Rex stood apart, his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with cold fury. He knew the next move would decide everything. The store fell into a heavy silence, the faint hum of retreating engines lingering in the air. Jackson stood motionless, his sharp eyes scanning the room for signs of further intrusion. Smoke curled lazily from the extinguished flames, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Luke, still clutching his wrench, moved cautiously to Jackson's side. "They're regrouping," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you think they'll come back?" "They will," Jackson replied, his tone cold and certain. "And Rex will lead the charge himself this time. He's got too much pride to walk away now." Luke nodded, swallowing hard. "What do we do?" Jackson turned to him, his expression calm but commanding. "We draw them in, isolate Rex, and take him out of the equation. Without him, they'll scatter." Luke's eyes widened. "Take him out, you mean?" Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "I mean we end this, one way or another." Luke hesitated, the weight of Jackson's words sinking in. "What if we can't? What if there's too many?" Jackson placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip firm. "The numbers don't matter. What matters is that we make them fight on our terms. I've done this before and I can do it again." The determination in Jackson's voice sparked something in Luke. The fear that had gripped him since the bikers arrived began to fade, replaced by a flicker of courage. He straightened slightly, nodding. "All right, tell me what to do." Outside, Rex paced near the remaining bikes, his expression a mix of anger and calculation. The bikers around him were shaken, their earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. Several of them sported fresh injuries, broken limbs, bruised faces, bloodied hands. The traps and ambushes inside the store had taken a toll, and they knew it. One of Rex's lieutenants, a wiry man with a long scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Boss, this isn't worth it. We've already lost half our guys, and that store's a damn fortress. Maybe we cut our losses and—" Rex turned on him with a snarl, his fist connecting with the man's jaw before he could finish. The lieutenant stumbled back, clutching his face, as Rex loomed over him. "You think I'm walking away from this?" Rex barked, his voice seething with fury. "You think I'm going to let some washed-up soldier make a fool out of me?" The bikers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Rex's gaze swept over them, his eyes blazing. "We end this now. No more games. We go in together, we take him down, and we make an example out of him." The gang muttered their assent, though the tension in their ranks was palpable. Rex grabbed his weapon, a heavy chain with a steel hook at the end, and swung it once, the metal whistling through the air. "Let's go!" Inside the store, Jackson finished his final preparations. He had fortified the stairwell with a barricade of overturned shelves and furniture, creating a choke point that would force the bikers to funnel through one at a time. Hidden traps and improvised weapons were positioned throughout the space, each one designed to slow the attackers and exploit their overconfidence. Luke crouched near the stairs, holding the flashlight and a makeshift slingshot that Jackson had shown him how to use. His fear was still there, but it was tempered now by a sense of purpose. "Stay behind cover," Jackson instructed, his voice low but firm. "Aim for the eyes or hands, anything to disorient them." Luke nodded, his grip tightening on the slingshot. "What about you?" Jackson hefted his crowbar, the weight familiar in his hands. "I'll take care of the rest." The sound of boots and muffled voices outside signaled the bikers' approach. Jackson moved to the window and peered out, watching as they spread out around the store. Rex stood at the center, his chain swinging lazily in one hand. "They're coming," Jackson said, stepping back into the shadows. "Remember what I said. Stick to the plan." Luke nodded, his breathing steadying as he positioned himself behind the barricade. The two of them waited in tense silence, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. A loud crash broke the stillness as the bikers began their assault. They hit the front and back entrances simultaneously, battering the doors with a combination of brute force and tools. The barricades held, but the wood groaned under the relentless assault. Jackson moved swiftly, his every step deliberate and precise. The bikers would break through soon, but he was ready. This was his ground, and they would pay dearly for every inch they tried to take. The front door gave way first, splintering under the weight of a makeshift ram. The first wave of bikers surged in, their shouts filling the store. Jackson struck from the shadows, his crowbar swinging in a deadly arc. The first man went down with a scream, clutching his knee, while the second stumbled over him and fell into one of Jackson's traps, a wire snare that yanked his leg out from under him. At the back entrance, another crash signaled the biker's entry. Jackson turned to Luke and nodded. "Now." Luke flicked on the flashlight, the beam blinding the attackers as they pushed through the narrow hallway. He launched a rock from his slingshot, hitting the lead biker square in the forehead. The man shouted in pain, clutching his head as he stumbled back into his comrades. Jackson moved like a shadow, his strikes precise and unrelenting. The bikers' numbers meant little in the confined space where their own aggression worked against them. One by one, they fell to the traps and to Jackson's calculated blows. But amid the chaos, Rex's voice cut through, loud and commanding. "Miles! Enough of this cat-and-mouse crap. Face me!" Jackson turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Rex stepping into the store, his chain swinging in lazy, menacing loops. The other bikers hesitated, their gazes flickering between their leader and the man who had outmaneuvered them at every turn. Jackson straightened, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "You want me, Rex? Come and get me." Rex stepped forward, his boots crunching on shattered glass and debris. The chain in his hand swayed with each step, the steel hook at the end glinting faintly in the dim light. The other bikers fell back, forming a loose circle around the confrontation, their expressions tense. This wasn't just a fight, it was a test of dominance, a final clash to decide the night. Jackson stood his ground, his crowbar steady in his grip. His breathing was calm, his gaze locked on Rex, reading every movement, every shift of weight. He knew this wasn't going to be like the others. Rex was bigger, stronger, and experienced in a different kind of violence. But Jackson had been through worse. Rex smirked, his confidence unshaken despite the carnage around him. "You've been busy, haven't you?" he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Took out half my crew like it was nothing. I'll admit I didn't expect that from a storekeeper." Jackson didn't respond, his silence deliberate, calculated. Rex's smirk faded slightly as he swung the chain in a wide arc, the sound of the steel cutting through the air like a whip. "But you're out of tricks now," Rex continued, his voice hardening. "No more traps, no more shadows, just you and me." Rex lunged, the chain whipping toward Jackson with lethal speed. Jackson sidestepped, the hook narrowly missing his shoulder. He countered with a quick strike of his crowbar, aiming for Rex's exposed side. Rex twisted, the blow glancing off his ribs but forcing him back a step. "You've got moves," Rex said, his tone almost amused. "But let's see how long you can keep up." He attacked again, the chain snapping toward Jackson in a flurry of strikes. Jackson ducked and dodged, his movements sharp and efficient. He stayed light on his feet, waiting for an opening, forcing Rex to overextend. The two men circled each other, their weapons clashing in a brutal rhythm. The bikers watched in stunned silence, their earlier bravado replaced with a growing unease. Jackson, though smaller and older, moved with a precision and control that unnerved them. Every swing of Rex's chain was met with a calculated dodge, every wild lunge countered with a sharp, measured strike. Rex's frustration began to show. His swings became wilder, his movements less controlled. Jackson capitalized on the opening, stepping in close and delivering a powerful blow to Rex's knee. The larger man stumbled, letting out a grunt of pain as he dropped to one knee. Jackson pressed the advantage, bringing the crowbar down toward Rex's hand. The chain clattered to the ground as Rex let go, his grip broken. Jackson kicked the weapon away, sending it skidding across the floor. He raised the crowbar, poised for a final strike. "Do it!" Rex spat, his voice venomous. "End it!" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Jackson's grip tightened on the crowbar, his muscles tensing. His mind flashed with images, faces of those he'd lost, the weight of lives he couldn't save. The rage he'd kept buried for years surged to the surface, demanding release. But then he stopped. Jackson lowered the crowbar, his breathing steadying. "I'm not like you," he said quietly, his voice firm but calm. "I don't kill for power. I don't kill for control." He stepped back, his eyes still locked on Rex. "You're done. Get your people and get out." Rex stared at him, his expression a mix of disbelief and rage. For a moment it seemed as though he might lunge again, but the look in Jackson's eyes stopped him cold. This wasn't a man to cross. Not again. "Let's go," Rex barked, his voice hoarse. He pushed himself to his feet, limping toward the door. The bikers hesitated, their eyes darting between Rex and Jackson, before finally following their leader. One by one they disappeared into the night, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. The store was quiet now, the air heavy with smoke and the scent of burned wood. Jackson stood in the center of the room, his crowbar hanging loosely at his side. Luke emerged from the shadows, his face pale but his eyes wide with admiration. You let him go," Luke said, his voice filled with awe. Jackson nodded, his gaze distant. "He's beaten. That's enough." The boy looked around the room, taking in the wreckage and the silence that followed the chaos. "What happens now?" Jackson glanced toward the shattered front door, where the faint light of dawn was beginning to seep in. "We rebuild," he said simply. "And we make sure this doesn't happen again." Luke nodded, a faint smile breaking through his exhaustion. "You think they'll come back?" Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression resolute. "If they do, they'll know what to expect." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the night settling over them. Then Jackson set the crowbar aside and placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. "Get some rest," he said. "We've got work to do." Luke nodded, his trust in Jackson absolute. Together they began clearing the debris, the first steps toward reclaiming the peace that had been stolen from their small town. As the dust settles and dawn breaks over the small town store, a sense of quiet triumph lingers in the air. The ruthless bikers, once unstoppable in their terror, have retreated, broken and humiliated. At the heart of it all stands Jackson Miles, a man who reminded the world that courage, strategy, and the resolve to protect what's right can overcome even the darkest threats. His past, forged in the fires of war, became the shield that saved his town and the weapon that ensured its safety. But this isn't just a story of one man's strength. It's a testament to standing your ground when all odds are against you. Jackson's battle wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about reclaiming peace, restoring hope, and proving that even in the face of chaos, resilience can light the way forward. What would you do if faced with the same choice Jackson made? Would you stand, fight, and protect what matters most? Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and how this story resonated with you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales of courage and triumph. You won't want to miss what's coming next.